Before we get into this episode, I just want to say one thing. Goblins and orcs are the same creature. Honestly, the only reason I've ever seen as to why they should be considered different is that orcs are tall and goblins are short, and that's a stupid reason. So unless you can give me a very good explanation as to why they should be considered different creatures, I don't want to hear it. Sorry about that, I just had to get that out of the way, and I felt like people wouldn't read a disclaimer. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Monsters of the Mind. As always, I'm your host, Mr.G. So we all know elves, staple of fantasy media, small humanoids, pointed ears, yeah, you know, those guys. Well, I'm sure most of you are also aware of the elves' supposedly evil counterparts, known as goblins. The word goblin has a debatable meaning, but most of them do boil around to having mischievous natures or something or stuff like that. They were a species, and pretty much every work depicts all goblins as being evil. They lived in Europe and they come from European folklore. Goblins as monsters are usually depicted as being diminutive-sized humanoids, and in fantasy media they are often given green skin and no hair. Goblins are also usually described as being very mischievous and love messing with humans. Despite appearing in plenty of folklore beforehand, goblins ended up getting into mainstream attention when they were featured in J.R.R. Tolkien's books. These books are what set in stone a lot of ideas about modern-day goblins, such as them hating elves, having technicolor skin, and hating sunlight. Although a lot of these ideas were used in goblin stories beforehand, these books were what made them staples of goblin depictions. This story is also one of the most famous uses of a fantasy species being described as being completely evil, which ended up becoming a very popular trope in fiction. Okay, disclaimer. This next section will get fairly serious, so please keep that in mind. In recent years, goblins have received accusations of being anti-Semitic, which, if you don't know, anti-Semitism is basically anything that's offensive towards people who practice Judaism. The main point being that goblins are usually portrayed with large hook noses and are depicted as greedy, both of which are common Jewish stereotypes. Not helping is the fact that they're often compared to elves, which nowadays are often portrayed as being blonde hair and blue-eyed, and a lot of stories portray them as being a perfect species, while goblins are portrayed as lesser beings. Now, I am not saying that every goblin depiction is anti-Semitic, or even that it was the writer's intentions when these stories to make it seem that way. But things like this tend to happen when you don't think through your implications. Now, I don't think it's my place to say if goblins are inherently anti-Semitic. I'm not Jewish. So, to play it safe, I've decided not to have a Vincent segment in order to not say anything accidentally offensive, and I recommend doing your own research and coming to your own conclusions and decide for yourself if goblins are anti-Semitic. Sorry that I had to have that discussion. It's just become unavoidable with goblins in recent years. Don't worry, I've looked and I've made sure that almost none of the other monsters in the series have this problem. So this will probably be the only time I have to have a discussion like this. Let's just look at the card. You know, this card is odd because it claims that Lord of the Rings invented the concept of orcs or goblins, really. Like I said, I use the terms interchangeably personally. Even though most of the creatures in J.R.R. Tolkien's works were actually based on older mythological beings. In fact, this card is so convinced that instead of actually telling stories about goblins or orcs in modern times, they just kind of summarize what their role in the books were. You know, I've seen a lot of people who hate this depiction, but I don't mind it. Like I said, I'm a firm believer that orcs and goblins are synonymous. The card itself even acknowledges that in The Hobbit they were called goblins. This card gives me a conundrum. Should I rank it based off how accurate it is to the books or to goblin and orc lore in general? After thinking it through, I've decided that for not acknowledging that these books didn't create the concept of either species, I have to give it a 6 out of 10. The only reason it's not lower is because this is a fairly accurate portrayal of how goblins and orcs are portrayed in the series. So it gets points for that, but it loses a lot of points for pretending that these stories invented the creature. Now, because of the discussion, I didn't want to bog down this video with too many pop culture appearances, so I only stuck to some really basic stuff. so keep that in mind. Goblins were in Dungeons and Dragons. In Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, this is how orcs were portrayed. One of Spider-Man's villains is known as the Green Goblin. There's the Pokemon Impidimp, which seems to be a combination of a goblin and an imp. They've appeared in some Elder Scrolls games, and you can even play as them in Skyrim. The Zelda series features creatures called bokoblins, which are clearly based on goblins. They also had another goblin-esque creature known as bulbins. Goblins also appear in Harry Potter, where they not only have a lot of the same problems that I discussed earlier, but it adds another one by saying that goblins are in charge of the world's wealth, which is another Jewish stereotype. Things like this are what happen when we don't think through our implications. That's all for this episode of Monsters of the Mind. This was not a very fun episode. Next episode, we're talking about a creature that's like the Hydra, except it comes from Persia. Yeah. Bye.